Frontier, Iowa, 1852. While neighboring families rushed to harvest just enough grain to last the winter, Sarah Anderson was still working in late October, smoking venison, salt packing pork, and filling her hand-dug root cellar with carefully layered potatoes and onions. Her neighbors called it wasteful. They called her obsessive. With her husband away and 12 children to feed, she spent 2 months on food preservation that others finished in 2 weeks. She dried beans and pumpkins until they were leather hard. She packed meat in salt until it looked like white stones. She lined her cellar walls with sawdust, while others left vegetables in the frozen ground. Then November arrived. The first blizzard hit without warning, followed by the coldest winter in recorded memory. Crops that neighbors left unharvested rotted under 3 feet of snow. Standard root cellars froze solid. Families began rationing their children's food by January, but Sarah's cellar stayed above freezing. Her salt-packed meat lasted through March. Her dried vegetables fed 12 children without a single day of hunger. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about food preservation and winter survival that everyone else missed? And how did her impossible methods become the difference between starvation and abundance when 3 consecutive winters of failed crops tested every family's will to survive? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The October wind cut across the Iowa prairie with a bite that promised an early winter, and Sarah Anderson could feel it in her bones. While her neighbors hurried to complete their harvests with the bare minimum of preparation, she stood in her smokehouse at dawn, methodically arranging strips of venison on wooden racks she had built herself. The meat hung in precise rows, each piece cut exactly 3 inches wide and half an inch thick, dimensions her mother had taught her in their Norwegian village, where a miscalculation in preservation could mean death before spring's return. John Carter rode past her property that morning, shaking his head as he watched Sarah tend to her smoke fire with the dedication most women reserve for Sunday worship. "Still at it, Sarah," he called out, reining in his horse. "Most of us finished putting up meat a week ago. Winter's not coming tomorrow, you know." His tone carried the patronizing certainty of a man who had survived 5 frontier winters and considered himself an expert on the subject. Sarah looked up from adjusting the oak chips in her fire, her hands stained black from the constant tending. "In Norway, we learned that winter preparation begins in July," she replied quietly, returning to her work. "What seems like enough is rarely enough when the cold truly settles in." Carter laughed, a sharp sound that echoed across the prairie. "This isn't Norway, Sarah. American winters are different. You're wasting good hunting time on work that's already done." But Sarah had seen what already done looked like in her neighbor's preparations. Mary Lawson had salted her pork in a single afternoon, using barely half the salt Sarah's mother would have deemed necessary. The meat now hung in Mary's cellar in thick, uneven chunks that would spoil from the inside out before Christmas. Elias Peterson had built his root cellar in 3 days, digging barely 4 feet down and lining it with nothing more than loose stones, insufficient depth for the frost line, and inadequate insulation against the temperature swings that would rot his stored vegetables by February. Sarah's cellar, by contrast, had taken her 2 full weeks to complete. She had dug down 6 feet below the frost line her Norwegian grandfather had taught her to identify by the color and texture of the soil. The walls were lined with carefully fitted field stones, mortared with clay and sand mixed in proportions she had memorized as a child. Between the stones and the earth, she had packed sawdust 18 inches thick, a technique that seemed wasteful to her neighbors, but would maintain a steady temperature just above freezing throughout even the harshest winter. The real mockery came when Jacob Daniels visited her homestead in late October to witness what he called Sarah's folly. He found her in the cellar, carefully layering potatoes in wooden crates, each layer separated by exactly 2 inches of clean sawdust. "Good Lord, woman," Daniels said, watching her work by lamplight. "You're treating those potatoes like they're made of gold. I just dump mine in bins and cover them with straw. Takes me an hour, not a week." Sarah continued her methodical layering, placing each potato so it didn't touch its neighbors, creating air circulation that would prevent the spread of rot. "My mother lost a winter's worth of potatoes once because she rushed the storing," Sarah explained, not looking up from her work. "One bad potato can destroy 100 good ones if they're touching. The sawdust draws moisture away and keeps the temperature even. The extra time now means my children eat vegetables all winter instead of just salt pork and hardtack." Daniels snorted. "Your children will eat just fine without all this fussing. We've been surviving winters here for years without Norwegian tricks. You're making work where none needs doing." But even as he spoke, Sarah could see him taking mental notes of her technique, though his pride would never let him admit it. The true test of her methods came not in the cellar, but in her approach to meat preservation. While her neighbors had finished their smoking in a matter of days, Sarah maintained her fires for 3 full weeks. She kept the temperature in her smokehouse at exactly 90 degrees, hot enough to drive out moisture, but cool enough to avoid cooking the meat. She monitored the smoke constantly, adding specific combinations of oak, hickory, and applewood chips that her grandmother had sworn would preserve meat for up to 6 months. Her salt packing technique drew the most ridicule. Where others used salt as a light coating, Sarah buried her pork in crystalline white mounds that completely obscured the meat beneath. She had calculated the ratios precisely. 3 pounds of salt for every 10 pounds of pork, mixed with saltpeter and brown sugar in proportions that seemed extravagant to her neighbors, but had been refined over generations of Norwegian winters. The salt drew every drop of moisture from the meat, creating preservation that would last through multiple seasons if necessary. By early November, when the first serious snow began to fall, the contrast between Sarah's preparations and her neighbors became stark. Her smokehouse held enough preserved meat to feed 12 children through 6 months of winter. Her root cellar contained 500 pounds of potatoes, 200 pounds of onions, bushels of dried beans, and pumpkins cut into strips and dried until they resembled leather but would reconstitute into nutritious vegetables when soaked in hot water. Mary Lawson stopped by on the day of the first blizzard, ostensibly to borrow a cup of flour, but really to see how Sarah's extensive preparations were holding up. She found Sarah calmly retrieving vegetables from her cellar while the wind howled overhead. "Aren't you worried about running out?" Mary asked, eyeing the seemingly endless stores that lined Sarah's cellar walls. Sarah emerged with an armload of potatoes that looked as fresh as the day they were harvested, despite being stored for over a month. "Worried?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Mary, this is only the beginning. If my calculations are correct, these stores will carry us through until April, even if we get no fresh food at all." Mary left that day with a growing unease, realizing that her own hastily prepared stores would be exhausted by Christmas. The snow continued to fall, and Sarah Anderson settled in for what she knew would be a long winter, confident in methods that had sustained her ancestors through countless harsh seasons. Her neighbors, meanwhile, began to understand that their mockery had been premature, and that the woman they had called excessive might be the only one among them who truly understood what survival required. The blizzard that began on November 15th brought with it temperatures that plunged to 28 degrees below zero, colder than any winter the Iowa Territory had recorded. By the 3rd day of the storm, John Carter's hastily constructed cabin revealed the fatal flaws in his building philosophy. Ice formed on the inside walls despite his roaring fire, and the single-layer log construction he had deemed sufficient allowed cold air to seep through gaps he had chinked with nothing more than mud and prairie grass. His family huddled around their fireplace, burning through a month's worth of firewood in a single week, while the interior temperature never rose above 40 degrees. Carter's food storage proved equally inadequate. The root cellar he had dug in 2 days, barely 4 feet deep and lined with loose stones, froze solid during the first week of the cold snap. His potatoes turned black and mushy, transforming into inedible pulp that stank of decay. The turnips he had stored in wooden barrels split open as the water inside them expanded into ice, creating a sludgy mess that his family couldn't stomach, even in desperation. His wife Margaret stood in their frozen cellar, holding a lamp that illuminated the wreckage of their winter's food supply, and wept openly for the first time since leaving Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, 3 miles across the prairie, Sarah Anderson's cabin maintained a steady internal temperature of 68 degrees. Her double-wall construction, an extravagance her neighbors had mocked, proved its worth as the sawdust insulation between the inner and outer logs created a thermal barrier that held heat with remarkable efficiency. She burned less than half the firewood Carter consumed, yet her children played comfortably in their shirt sleeves while his family layered on every piece of clothing they owned just to survive near their fire. Sarah's preservation methods revealed their true genius during this first crisis. When she descended into her root cellar on November 20th, 5 days into the brutal cold, she found her potatoes exactly as she had stored them, firm, unblemished, and perfectly preserved in their sawdust-lined crates. The temperature in her cellar held steady at 36 degrees, just above freezing, maintained by the thermal mass of the carefully fitted stones and the insulating properties of the thick sawdust barrier she had installed. Her onions remained crisp and flavorful, stored in braided ropes that hung from the rafters, allowing air circulation that prevented the moisture buildup that would have caused rot. Elias Peterson discovered the consequences of his corner cutting when his family's grain stores began showing signs of insect damage he had ignored during harvest. The weevils that had seemed like a minor nuisance in October multiplied rapidly in the warmth of his poorly ventilated storage area, rendering bushels of wheat and corn inedible. His wife Anna ground what remained of their clean grain into flour, stretching it with bark meal and anything else she could find to make it last. Their children complained constantly of hunger, subsisting on thin gruel, while Peterson cursed himself for not heeding Sarah's warnings about proper grain inspection and storage. Mary Lawson's situation grew desperate by the end of November. The pork she had salted in a single afternoon began showing green patches of mold, the insufficient salt having failed to draw out enough moisture to prevent spoilage. She cut away the moldy portions at first, but as the contamination spread, she found herself discarding meat that represented weeks of her family's protein. Her root vegetables, stored without proper temperature control in a shallow cellar, alternated between freezing and thawing as temperatures fluctuated, creating a cycle of cellular damage that turned her turnips and carrots into inedible mush. Jacob Daniels, the experienced carpenter who had dismissed Sarah's building methods as excessive, watched his own construction techniques fail under the pressure of the extreme cold. The gaps he had left between logs, confident that basic chinking would suffice, allowed wind to howl through his cabin like a sieve. His family moved their bedrolls closer and closer to the fire as the nights grew colder, until they were sleeping in a tight circle around the hearth, waking with frost on their blankets, despite the flames crackling just feet away. On December 1st, as the cold snap entered its third week, Sarah's methodical approach to food preservation continued to pay dividends. Her salt-packed pork, buried in its crystalline white mounds, remained perfectly preserved and deliciously edible. When she unwrapped portions for her family's meals, the meat appeared as fresh as the day it was packed, the salt having created an environment completely hostile to spoilage. Her dried vegetables, stored in sealed containers with bay leaves to deter insects, reconstituted into nutritious stews that kept her 12 children healthy and satisfied. The contrast became impossible to ignore when Mary Lawson appeared at Sarah's door on December 5th, carrying her youngest child and fighting back tears of desperation. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "could you spare some food? Anything at all? Our stores, they've gone bad. The meat spoiled, and the vegetables froze and rotted." Sarah welcomed her inside without hesitation, noting how Mary's child felt thin and fragile in her arms, and how Mary herself had the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been giving her own food to her children. That same week, Carter's family began boiling leather scraps from old harnesses, trying to extract any nutrition from materials they would never have considered food during better times. Peterson traded his best hunting rifle to a neighboring family for a single smoked ham, a transaction that spoke to his growing desperation. Daniels found himself studying the construction of Sarah's cabin from the outside, noting the double walls and careful chinking that kept her family comfortable while his own construction failed so dramatically. By mid-December, the patterns were clear. Sarah's excessive preparations had proven to be precisely calibrated for survival, while the conventional wisdom that had guided her neighbors' efforts proved inadequate when tested by genuine hardship. The woman they had mocked for her caution now represented their best hope for making it through a winter that showed no signs of ending anytime soon. By January 10th, the temperature had not risen above zero for 3 consecutive weeks, and the social dynamics of the small frontier community had shifted dramatically. John Carter, the man who had so confidently dismissed Sarah's methods just 2 months earlier, stood at her door holding his hat in his hands and struggling to meet her eyes. His family had been reduced to eating boiled tree bark mixed with the last of their spoiled grain, and his youngest daughter had developed a persistent cough that echoed through their inadequately heated cabin. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse from pride and desperation, "I need to ask you about your preservation methods. My family, we're not going to make it through at this rate." Sarah invited him inside, where the warmth hit him like a physical force after the bone-deep cold of his own home. Her children sat around the kitchen table, working on their lessons while a pot of rich stew simmered on the stove, a luxury that seemed impossible given the circumstances outside. The stew contained recognizable chunks of meat and vegetables that looked as fresh as if they had been harvested yesterday, not months ago during the brief autumn growing season. Carter could smell the complex flavors of properly preserved pork, reconstituted dried vegetables, and herbs that had somehow retained their potency through the long storage period. "The meat preservation," Carter began hesitantly, "how exactly did you calculate the salt ratios?" Sarah moved to her pantry and returned with a piece of salt-packed pork, unwrapping it to reveal meat that appeared perfectly preserved despite being stored for over 3 months. 3 pounds of salt for every 10 pounds of pork," she explained, showing him how the meat remained firm and fragrant. "But it's not just salt. Saltpeter prevents the meat from graying, and brown sugar draws out moisture while adding flavor. The proportions matter more than most people realize. Too little salt, and the meat spoils. Too much, and it becomes inedible." Elias Peterson arrived that same afternoon, his Norwegian heritage giving him a cultural connection to Sarah's methods that made his previous rejection of them sting even more sharply. His family had been surviving on increasingly thin gruel made from their remaining uncontaminated grain, and his children had begun showing signs of malnutrition despite his desperate efforts to stretch their supplies. "I should have listened," he admitted to Sarah, watching her demonstrate how she reconstituted her dried vegetables by soaking them in warm water until they regained their original texture and nutritional value. Peterson was particularly interested in Sarah's root cellar techniques, having watched his own shallow storage pit fail so catastrophically. Sarah led him down into her cellar, where the temperature remained a constant 36 degrees despite the brutal cold above ground. The carefully fitted stone walls, mortared with precise clay mixtures and insulated with 18 inches of sawdust, had created a microenvironment that protected hundreds of pounds of stored vegetables. "The key is thermal mass," Sarah explained, running her hand along the stone wall. "These stones absorb heat during warmer periods and release it slowly when temperatures drop. The sawdust insulation prevents heat transfer, so the stones maintain an even temperature regardless of what's happening outside." Mary Lawson became Sarah's most frequent visitor during this period, arriving daily with her children to help with food preparation in exchange for meals that kept her family alive. Sarah taught her the intricate process of reconstituting dried vegetables, showing how different vegetables require different soaking times and water temperatures to regain their optimal nutrition and flavor. Dried beans needed to be soaked overnight in cool water, then slowly heated to prevent the skins from splitting. Dried pumpkin strips required hot water and patient stirring until they transformed back into the bright orange flesh that had been carefully preserved months earlier. The technical precision of Sarah's methods became apparent as Mary learned each process. Sarah's dried corn had been prepared using a specific technique that involved blanching the kernels for exactly 3 minutes before drying, a step that preserved both nutrition and flavor while preventing the tough, inedible texture that characterized improperly prepared dried corn. Her herb preservation involved bundling specific combinations of plants at precisely the right stage of maturity, drying them in controlled conditions, and storing them with bay leaves to prevent insect damage. Jacob Daniels swallowed his considerable pride and approached Sarah about her construction techniques in late January, when his family's situation became truly desperate. His cabin had become virtually uninhabitable, with interior temperatures rarely rising above freezing despite burning enormous quantities of increasingly scarce firewood. Sarah walked him around her property, explaining the double-wall construction that had seemed so extravagant during building season. "The inner wall provides structure and immediate heat retention," she demonstrated, showing how the logs were fitted with precise notching and sealed with a mixture of clay, sand, and chopped straw. The outer wall creates a thermal barrier, and the sawdust between them acts as insulation. The air gap is exactly 4 inches, enough for insulation value, but not so much that convection currents develop. Daniels took careful notes as Sarah explained how she had positioned her fireplace in the center of the cabin rather than against an exterior wall, a decision that had seemed wasteful of interior space, but now proved to radiate heat evenly throughout the structure. Her chimney design incorporated a series of internal baffles that captured and redirected heat that would otherwise escape. Directly outside, a technique her Norwegian grandfather had perfected during decades of harsh winters. By February 1st, Sarah's cabin had become an informal community center where desperate neighbors gathered to learn survival techniques their grandparents had known, but their generation had abandoned in favor of faster, cheaper methods. She demonstrated how to stretch preserved meat by creating hearty stews with reconstituted vegetables, how to maintain nutrition during extended periods of food scarcity, and how to keep children healthy when fresh food became unavailable. The irony was not lost on anyone present that the woman they had dismissed as overly cautious now represented their primary hope for survival. Sarah shared her knowledge freely, without reproach or condescension, understanding that community survival ultimately served everyone's interests. Yet, even as she taught them her techniques, The harsh reality remained that knowledge gained in February could not undo the inadequate preparations of October, and the winter showed no signs of releasing its grip on the Iowa frontier. March arrived with no relief from the relentless cold, and the community faced its darkest hour as food supplies reached critical levels throughout the settlement. John Carter's family had been reduced to rationing their children's meals to a single bowl of thin gruel per day, made from the last of their contaminated grain, mixed with whatever they could forage from the frozen landscape. His wife Margaret had begun giving her own portions to their youngest children, a sacrifice that left her gaunt and weak, barely able to tend the fire that provided their only protection against the killing cold. Carter himself had lost nearly 30 pounds, his clothes hanging loose on his diminished frame as he struggled to maintain any semblance of normal family routine. The situation at the Peterson household had deteriorated beyond mere hunger into genuine starvation. Elias Peterson's children had developed the telltale signs of severe malnutrition, swollen bellies, thinning hair, and a listless behavior that spoke to their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue for survival. Anna Peterson had begun boiling leather boots and harnesses, straining the liquid through cloth to create a broth that provided minimal nutrition but helped fill their children's stomachs enough to quiet their constant crying. The family had burned through their furniture for firewood, feeding chair legs and table planks into their fireplace in a desperate attempt to maintain enough heat to prevent freezing to death in their own home. Mary Lawson's situation had become the most desperate of all. With no husband to hunt or trade for supplies, she watched helplessly as her children grew thinner each day, despite her efforts to stretch their remaining food. She had begun mixing clay with the last of their flour to create more volume, a dangerous practice that filled stomachs temporarily but provided no nutrition and could cause serious digestive problems. Her youngest child, barely 2 years old, had stopped crying from hunger, a silence that terrified Mary more than the previous weeks of constant wailing had tormented her. Against this backdrop of community-wide suffering, Sarah Anderson's household continued to function with a stability that seemed almost miraculous to her desperate neighbors. Her 12 children maintained their regular routines, attending to their studies and chores, with the energy that comes from adequate nutrition and warmth. Her food stores, calculated with Norwegian precision for exactly this type of extended crisis, continued to provide varied and nutritious meals that kept her family not just alive, but genuinely healthy throughout the ordeal. When Sarah assessed her remaining supplies in early March, she found her calculations had been remarkably accurate. Her salt-packed pork retained its quality and flavor, with enough remaining to last through May if necessary. The root vegetables in her cellar showed minimal spoilage. Perhaps 5% of her potatoes had developed soft spots that she removed carefully to prevent contamination of the remaining stores. Her dried vegetables continued to reconstitute perfectly, providing essential vitamins that prevented the scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies that were beginning to appear among her neighbors' families. The moral complexity of abundance amid starvation weighed heavily on Sarah's conscience. Each day brought new requests for help from families whose earlier mockery had transformed into desperate pleading. She faced the agonizing decision of how much aid she could provide without jeopardizing her own family's survival, particularly with no guarantee that spring would arrive on schedule or that the growing season would prove successful enough to replenish depleted food stores. Sarah developed a systematic approach to community assistance that balanced compassion with practicality. She provided daily meals to the children of the most desperate families, focusing on those showing signs of severe malnutrition while asking the adults to contribute labor in exchange for food. This arrangement allowed her to extend her supplies while maintaining community dignity and preventing the complete breakdown of social structures that often accompanied such crises. The work for food arrangement revealed the technical aspects of Sarah's success, that her neighbors had never fully understood. Carter spent his days learning to properly maintain Sarah's preservation systems, discovering that her salt-packed meat required regular inspection and rotation to prevent localized moisture buildup. Peterson worked in her root cellar, learning how the careful air circulation and temperature monitoring prevented the spoilage that had destroyed his own stores. These men, who had dismissed her methods as excessive just months earlier, now witnessed firsthand the precise calculations and constant attention that made her system function reliably. Mary Lawson became Sarah's most dedicated student, learning not just immediate survival techniques, but the foundational principles that would allow her to implement similar systems for future seasons. Sarah taught her how to calculate preservation ratios for different types of meat, how to identify the optimal moisture content for vegetable drying, and how to construct storage systems that would maintain stable temperatures throughout winter months. These lessons represented more than mere technique. They constituted a transfer of cultural knowledge that had sustained Northern European populations through countless harsh winters. The children of the community began spending entire days at Sarah's homestead, where regular meals and warm shelter allowed them to maintain their health, while their parents struggled with the logistics of survival. Sarah organized educational activities that kept the children occupied while teaching practical skills they would need as adults. The older children learned food preservation techniques, while younger ones helped with basic food preparation tasks that freed adults for more complex work. By mid-March, the community had effectively reorganized itself around Sarah's homestead, with families taking shifts to help with the labor-intensive tasks required to maintain her preservation systems while receiving meals that kept them alive. The arrangement worked because Sarah's initial preparations had been calculated not just for her own family's survival, but with enough margin to assist others during exactly this type of crisis, a foresight that her Norwegian upbringing had ingrained as essential community responsibility. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone involved. The woman whose methods had been dismissed as primitive and excessive now served as the anchor point for community survival, her techniques proving more sophisticated and reliable than the modern approaches her neighbors had favored. Yet, even as her system sustained them through the worst crisis any of them had experienced, everyone understood that survival through March was only meaningful if they could last until spring planting season arrived and food production could resume. When the first thaw arrived on March 28th, revealing prairie grass beneath 3 months of accumulated snow, the transformation in the community's understanding of survival was complete and irreversible. John Carter stood in Sarah's root cellar that morning, methodically cataloging her remaining stores with the reverence of a man who had witnessed genuine mastery. Her potatoes still filled 2 complete crates, firm and unblemished after 5 months of storage. Her onions hung in neat braids from the rafters, their papery skins intact and their cores still crisp enough to add flavor and nutrition to the community meals that had sustained them through the worst crisis any of them had experienced. Carter had already begun planning his own storage systems for the coming growing season, sketching designs that incorporated every principle Sarah had taught him during the long winter months. His drawings showed root cellars dug to the precise 6-foot depth that would place them below the frost line, with stone walls 18 inches thick and sawdust insulation barriers calculated to maintain steady temperatures regardless of surface conditions. He had learned to calculate thermal mass requirements, understanding that the carefully fitted stones served not just as structural elements, but as heat batteries that would moderate temperature swings throughout the storage season. Elias Peterson spent the early spring days constructing a smokehouse based on Sarah's exact specifications, building the structure with double walls and installing the ventilation system that would allow him to maintain the 90-degree temperature essential for proper meat preservation. His Norwegian heritage, which he had abandoned in favor of American expediency, now reasserted itself as he remembered childhood observations of his grandfather's preservation techniques that aligned perfectly with Sarah's methods. Peterson's wife, Anna, worked alongside Sarah to learn the precise timing required for vegetable drying, understanding now that the 3-minute blanching period for corn kernels was not arbitrary, but calculated to preserve both nutrition and storage life. Mary Lawson had become Sarah's most accomplished student, mastering not just individual techniques, but the systematic approach that made large-scale food preservation possible for a single person managing multiple preservation methods simultaneously. She learned to coordinate the timing of different preservation processes, smoking meat while vegetables dried, and root vegetables cured in preparation for long-term storage. Mary's notebook filled with measurements, temperatures, and timing specifications that represented a complete education in traditional food preservation adapted for frontier conditions. Jacob Daniels spent the spring months completely rebuilding his cabin using Sarah's construction principles, creating a structure that would provide his family with the warmth and comfort they had been denied during the brutal winter. His new cabin featured double-wall construction with precise 4-inch air gaps filled with sawdust insulation, interior fireplaces positioned to maximize heat distribution, and chinking systems that would prevent the air infiltration that had made his previous cabin uninhabitable. Daniels documented his construction process meticulously, creating plans that he would share with new settlers arriving in the territory. The community's adoption of Sarah's methods extended beyond individual families to collective efforts that would benefit the entire settlement. They organized communal preservation activities that allowed families to share labor and resources while ensuring everyone had access to the knowledge and equipment necessary for successful food storage. The smokehouse Carter built incorporated design improvements suggested by Sarah's experience with better ventilation systems and temperature control mechanisms that would serve multiple families during harvest season. Sarah observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, understanding that her knowledge had taken root in ways that would benefit the community for generations. She had never sought recognition or acknowledgement for her methods, driven instead by the practical necessity of keeping her family alive through whatever challenges the frontier might present. Yet the transformation of her neighbors from skeptics to dedicated students represented validation of principles that had sustained her ancestors through countless harsh seasons in Northern Europe. The spring planting season revealed how thoroughly the community had internalized Sarah's approach to preparation and planning. Families planted diverse crops specifically chosen for their preservation characteristics, selecting varieties of beans that dried well, corn that could be stored long-term, and root vegetables that would maintain their nutrition through months of storage. They built their storage systems before the growing season began, ensuring that harvest time activities could focus on food preparation rather than construction projects. The knowledge transfer extended to construction techniques that would prevent the heating failures that had nearly killed several families during the winter. New cabins built that spring incorporated Sarah's insulation principles as standard features rather than expensive luxuries, with builders understanding that proper construction was not wasteful but essential for survival. The community developed standardized specifications for root cellars, smokehouses, and food storage systems that reflected the hard-won lessons of the previous winter. By summer, visiting travelers remarked on the unusual prosperity and organization of the small Iowa settlement, noting the sophisticated food preservation systems and the exceptionally well-built cabins that seemed designed for much harsher conditions than the region typically experienced. They could not have known that these improvements represented the community's response to a winter that had tested every assumption about frontier survival and revealed the inadequacy of conventional wisdom when faced with genuine crisis. Sarah's methods, once dismissed as excessive and primitive, had become the foundation for a more resilient and prepared community that understood the difference between adequate preparation and true readiness for unpredictable challenges. Her 12 children grew up witnessing not just their mother's technical expertise, but the transformation of an entire community's approach to survival, learning lessons about preparation, humility, and the value of traditional knowledge that would serve them throughout their lives. The Norwegian techniques that had seemed so foreign and unnecessary to American settlers proved to be precisely calibrated for the realities of frontier life, where miscalculation or inadequate preparation could mean death for entire families. Sarah Anderson had preserved more than food during that brutal winter. She had preserved knowledge, community bonds, and a way of life that honored both individual self-reliance and collective responsibility for survival in an unforgiving environment.